Chapter 7, Human Memory. Basic questions we're going to be addressing in this second lecture. How do we get information out of memory? It's retrieval. How accurate are our memories? What are the implications of the fallibility of memory? And why do we forget? So let's look at the retrieval process first here. So I'm going to read you a story. And once I'm done reading you the story, I'd like you to pause this and then try your best to recount to yourself the details of the story. All right? So here it goes. A TWA Boeing 747 had just taken off from Miami International Airport for Los Angeles when a passenger near the rear of the aircraft announced that the plane was being taken over by the People's Revolutionary Army for the liberation of the oppressed. The hijacker held a .357 Magnum to the head of Jack Swanson, a flight attendant, and forced him to open the cockpit door. There, the hijacker confronted the pilot, Jane Randall, and ordered her to change course for Cuba. The pilot radioed the Miami Air Traffic Control Center to report the situation, but then suddenly hurled the microphone at the hijacker. The hijacker fell backward through the open cockpit door and onto the floor, where angry passengers took over from there. The plane landed in Miami a few minutes later, and the hijacker was arrested. So pause this, and to yourself, try to recount the details of that story I just read you. All right, so presumably there was some inaccuracies in the recall of the story. And what this illustrates is the first thing I would like to talk with you about is the reconstructive nature of memory. So memory doesn't work like a video tape does or a digital recording of some event, but rather memory at best is a reasonably accurate process of reconstructing what we believe was the case. So there were some problems with the recounting of the story. I imagine typical problems include shortening the story. It obviously gets shorter for most people because you forget some of the details. Other things that happen is that often people will use terrorist instead of hijacker. In the age of homeland security and terrorism and that sort of thing, this is an expectation based on experience. That is, we learned about schemas last time, so sometimes we can distort our memory or change our memory of what we believe we heard or saw so that it is consistent with our schemas, our expectations, and so forth based on experience. Other details include sometimes changing the names of the pilot and the flight attendant. So the flight attendant's name was Jack Swanson. Often the flight attendant becomes the pilot, Jack Swanson, because there's a stereotype that most airplane pilots are male. Actually, that's probably not a stereotype. It's probably the case. But our schema is that men fly planes and women do not. Women are the flight attendants. Tragically, that's the way it is. So Jack Swanson becomes the pilot and Jane Randall becomes the flight attendant. So anyway, there's details. Shortening is probably the first thing that happens, and then changing the details so that they're consistent with our schemas is the other thing that happens. So memory is this reconstructive process. It can be highly inaccurate. So some of the things that we do to try to retrieve information that we've encoded is use cues. So inaccurate as it is, or as it can be, memory can also be fairly reliable, but we rely on these cues to get stuff back out. So one of the types of retrieval cues that people often use are verbal cues. So I'm going to remind you of a novel stimulus that we encountered in the first lecture. It was a new word, I presume, for most people, and we spent some time talking about it. And we talked about it in the context of, well, actually I won't tell you the context because that will probably help you. But anyway, it was a new word that we learned last time. And see if you can think of it. Some of you may be able to dredge it right back up, or maybe you watched the lecture right before this one, but anyway, I'll give you a hint. It starts with an I. Right, so some of you may have that word on the tip of your tongue, and this is a phenomenon that involves a failure to retrieve. And believe me, this happens more and more as you age because memory begins to fail, where you experience decrements in memory as you begin to age. So tip of the tongue means that it's in there, you just can't get it out quite as effectively as you'd like. So tip of the tongue, if I give you a verbal cue, it's like, oh yeah, I got it. So the word is iatrogenic. So tip of the tongue phenomenon I'm just mentioning here is a failure in retrieval, but if we're given a verbal cue, like the first letter or what the word sounds like, often that can aid in the retrieval process. The other thing I want to mention quickly are contextual cues. So one of the ways that we can help in the retrieval process is by reinstating the context and event of the event. So if I tell you the context in which you learn that new word, it might help in recalling what the word is. So if I give the context, it was in the context of Craig and Lockhart's levels of processing. That is, we talked about structural, phonemic, and semantic levels of processing. Then if I reinstate the context, you might say, oh yeah, I remember that. So often in movies and so forth, we see detectives taking people back to the scene of the crime, like a witness of a crime might be returned to the context in which the crime was committed to help jog some memories. So both verbal cues and contextual cues are useful in aiding in recall of information. Any others that you can think of? Often smell is something that students will mention. Smells can trigger certain memories and so forth, but there's other cues that can help us recover memories. So I want to spend some time talking about problems in reconstruction. Allport and Postman conducted a study back in 1947. You're seeing a slide from the study. And so subjects were shown, or research participants were shown this image. And what you're seeing here, it's a little hard to tell, but what you're seeing is this white guy holding a straight razor to a black guy in a subway. He's mugging this guy, all right? So when research participants were asked after viewing this slide who was holding the straight razor, more often than not, subjects said it was the black guy. So what this illustrates is the fact that memory is an active process. It's reconstructive and it's active. That is, reality can be changed to fit in with our schemas. So one of the things we discussed last time is storage and how we store information in the form of schemas. And these are those organized clusters of information based on experience. And my analogy was how we store stuff away in a storage space or an attic. We have certain tubs that we label and so forth. Think of a schema as sort of being a similar thing. That is, we have these chunks of information based on our experience, and we use those schemas to organize information. So what this suggests is that if we have a schema for crime and who is more likely to or not to commit a crime, and we may change the actual event such that it corresponds with our schema. And this study was conducted back in 1947, and I suspect schemas have changed since then. I hope they have, but stereotypes about who commits crime or who is more likely to mug who back then probably were more permeated by racial prejudice and discrimination and so forth than they are now, one would hope. But this is what's happening, and that was how the results were explained, is that we have expectations or these schemas, and then we're changing the actual events so that they correspond with our schemas. So memory is active. Research on some of the ways that memory can fail us with respect to changing information so that it fits with our schemas has been conducted by a woman named Elizabeth Loftus, who's kind of a big name in this area. And I'm just going to go over a study that Loftus conducted that illustrates some of the problems in reconstruction. So here's the deal. Two groups were shown a film. It was the same film of cars engaging in or having an accident. One group was asked about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The other group was asked about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. So the independent variable was the word, right? The levels were hit or smashed. So the idea was, would there be any difference in post-test in the participants' reports of the accident based on just changing a single word? So the responsive subject asked 1 week later, did you see any broken glass? And I want to remind you that they both saw the same film. In the in the hit condition, 14% of participants reported seeing broken glass. In the smashed condition, 32%. So that's over double the amount in the smashed condition reporting seeing broken glass when there actually was none. So that's substantial, and it's a matter of concern for cases that in which the authorities are involved, like legal cases, that a clever attorney can manipulate eyewitness testimony by using words to trigger schemas, activate schemas, so that the actual events are distorted to fit in with the schemas. So that's why attorneys really have to be on their toes. They have to be paying attention to every single word, because an attorney can ask a leading question, hit, smashed, and expect to see there being some change in the eyewitness's story. This is why eyewitness testimony, it's powerful, but it's limited given what we know about memory and its accuracy. So what we are witnessing in this study is what's called the misinformation effect. And that's the introduction of misleading information that activates those existing schemas. So this is an example of the misinformation effect. Another problem of reconstruction that I want to mention is the source monitoring error. And this is when memory derived from one source is misattributed to another source. I've got a video that I'd like you to watch. You can pause this and watch the video, or you can continue to listen and then watch the video thereafter. But essentially what source monitoring error has to do with is that we attribute a memory to a particular situation or person or event when it actually had nothing to do with that person, situation, or event. Right? So I'll give you an example. And this is sort of a horrific example, but it's an example nonetheless, that suppose somebody recalls being sexually abused as an adult. The abuse happened when they were a child, and they are convinced that it was their father, and typically this is the case. It's a male offending against a female minor. And this memory is actually incorrect. It was the uncle who was the perpetrator, but the person is convinced that the perpetrator's abuse was her father, and so what she's doing is she's misattributed the abuse to her father when the actual perpetrator was her uncle. Often people will have dreams that they'll confuse with reality. This has happened before, that you'll recall something, you're certain that it happened in reality, but it's actually a dream. And there's other instances where we misattribute the source of a memory, and this is source monitoring error. And again, in cases of eyewitness testimony, this can be very problematic, as you will see in the video. So, concept check regarding these problems in reconstruction. Tyler witnessed an automobile accident and heard one of the bystanders casually mention that the driver was probably intoxicated, even though the driver had not been drinking and had never crossed the center line. Because of this, Tyler tells the police officer investigating the accident that the car had been weaving all over the road. Tyler's faulty recall best illustrates A, the misinformation effect, B, mood-dependent memory, C, source monitoring error, D, proactive interference. The answer is A, the misinformation effect. It's not source monitoring error because the question doesn't have to do with the source of the memory, but rather it has to do with what was recalled and how the activation of a schema, such as somebody being intoxicated and how that affects their driving, is operating here in the misinformation effect. Activation of the intoxication schema. All right, I want to talk a little bit here about the repressed memories controversy. And just to give you a little bit of background, back in the 90s, there were a number of cases that made it into the national media. And the cases involved women, sometimes in their 20s or 30s, through the processes of therapy, had recovered memories of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. So accusations were made against male perpetrators, fathers and so forth, uncles. And some of these cases went to trial, and in some instances the individuals were convicted and went to prison. And books were published and so forth. The Courage to Heal is one of them. And this is one of those self-help books that you are essentially provided with a checklist and a number of different things you might be experiencing, and then what this the suggestion is that you can sort of self-diagnose yourself as having been traumatized through sexual abuse. And so the controversy particularly had to do with the on the one side, the well-meaning clinicians, the people working with individuals who are struggling in relationships and so forth because of some unknown reason. These well-meaning clinicians suggesting ultimately that the person might have been sexually abused, even in the absence of corroborating evidence, even in the absence of certainty or supposed certainty on behalf of the sufferer, but rather it was suggested, and then ultimately the person said, well, yeah, maybe that's what happened. So on the one hand, you have the well-meaning clinicians, and then on the other hand, you have investigators like Elizabeth Loftus, who have shown through their research that memory can be highly fallible, particularly memories that supposedly occurred 15, 20 years ago. Anyway, so let's just look at two sides of this. So the clinicians believe, and these are the people working with individuals struggling, that the report should be accepted at face value and believed to be true. That is, well-meaning clinicians don't consider themselves to be in the business of asking or questioning somebody's reports of sexual abuse or supposed sexual abuse, but rather they're to be their advocate and to believe them. Quite possibly nobody's ever believed them before. So they believe that that is their role. Research also shows that there can be amnesia for traumatic memories. It's pretty clear that people can be amnestic around various acts. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse. It could be an automobile accident or whatever sort of trauma that somebody experiences can create trauma-induced amnesia. Freud introduced the notion of repression. This is motivated forgetting. That is, some events are just too disturbing and anxiety-producing for us to face head-on, and so we push it into our unconscious. And then it festers there, so to speak, and affects our lives in ways that become symptoms of some underlying issue. So on the other hand, we have reports not being accepted at face value, and this is the position of those individuals who know something about the way memory works. We know, based on the last couple of slides, about the misinformation effect and source monitoring error. So there's clear ways that memory can be skewed. We can confuse the source. We can have schemas activated that can distort our recall. Research has also shown that false memories can easily be created. So I'm going to read you a list of words here, and then I'm going to ask you to recall these words. So don't write them down. That would be cheating. So I'm going to read you this list of words, and then I'd like you to pause this video and then write as many as you can down, and then I'm going to give you a recall test. All right, here we go. Rest, slumber, nap, crash, bed, mattress, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, REM, snore, drowsy. All right, pause this and write down as many of those words as you can. All right, so presumably you pause this and you've written down the words, and if you have the word sleep in your list, which you might, that would be incorrect because I never read the word sleep. However, sleep is associated with the various words that I read to you. And if we go back to lecture 1, we can imagine that sleep is being part of a semantic network associated with the words that I read to you, which all had something to do with sleep, but I never read sleep. So it's pretty easy to create what are considered as false memories. I could ask you, how confident were you or are you that you heard the word sleep? And some of you might have said, I know you read that word. I'm positive that you did, but the fact is that I didn't. So there's been studies that show how simple and easy it is to create memories, false memories, stuff that never happened. And because of this, and along with the misinformation effect and the source monitoring error, the memory researchers have a pretty good argument. That is, certainly it's possible that somebody could repress or have an amnesia around a traumatic incident, but we also have to take into account that memory is highly fallible. So because of the controversy, the American Psychiatric Association back in the 90s made a statement. And here is that statement. It is not known how to distinguish with complete accuracy memories based on true events from those derived from other sources. So if you think about this, this is a rather profound statement. That is, we can never be sure, particularly in a court of law, when you're trying to sort out what happened. There's no way, simply no way, to sort out what's true and actual from what is not. And so essentially it becomes a matter of confidence. And if this is a jury trial, then the defense and the prosecution have to persuade the jury to believe one way or the other. So currently the resolution is this, and this is kind of the middle ground, that certainly clinicians have an obligation to their clients and their patients that they're seeing to believe them. But they also have an obligation, given what we know about memory, to try to seek corroborating evidence. And this would be the strongest case. To try to find other people who are willing to come forward and either say that they were abused as well, or that they witnessed something, or give some sort of corroborating evidence. Otherwise, it turns into this, essentially this unknown entity. And that's problematic, particularly if you've been victimized and you can't seem to convince anybody that this has happened, or you haven't, and somebody who's innocent, who had not done any sort of not engaged in any sort of sexual misconduct is punished. So let's talk about forgetting a little bit. We talked a little bit about long-term memory storage last time, sort of that it's a potentially unlimited capacity. The question has been permanent. Does stuff stay permanently in long-term memory? Some of the evidence to suggest that is early evidence to suggest that it was permanent comes from research on what are called flashbulb memories. And I've got a picture of 9/11 there, Tuesday, September 11th, because I remember what the morning was like on that day. I remember with what I believe are particularly vivid details what happened during that day, even in the next couple of days. And some of you may have that same recollection, even though it's been a while. Generation before me remembered what they were doing and where they were and so forth on the day that John F. Kennedy Jr. was assassinated. So these are called flashbulb memories. It's almost like an event is burned into our memory, and we claim to be able to recall those events with this incredible detail. But the fact is that certainly we might have fairly accurate recall for those events, but is it 100% accurate? And the actual fact is no. They're fallible. So what this suggests is that even though we think that the information is permanent in long-term memory, that there's stuff that will never go away, certainly it does. We do forget. So I want to talk about some of the theories pertaining to forgetting, why stuff goes away. Ineffective encoding is the first theory I just want to mention, and in particular pseudo-forgetting. So pseudo-forgetting is really not forgetting at all because you never encoded it into memory in the first place. So the first thing that we talked about is in this section is paying attention and how we need to pay attention to encode information into memory. But what if you had poor encoding initially? That is, maybe you were working in a distracting environment and you just didn't encode that information very effectively at all, or not at all. You think you did, but you really didn't. That's pseudo-forgetting. So we forget because we simply have failed to encode the information effectively or at all. Decay theory is simply that memory traces fade with time, so over time memory will just go away with the passage of time. And then interference theory, among the three mentioned here, interference theory has the strongest support. So you can think of interference as a failure to retrieve because of certain things, certain information interfering with the recall of other information. So I want to talk about interference theory. So there's two basic brands of interference that can lead us to fail to recall or have difficulty recalling information. Retroactive interference and proactive interference. So think of retroactive interference as when new learning interferes with previous learning. So learning new things can overwrite or obscure existing knowledge. So my example over here, let's say, and this is retroactive interference down here. You're studying French and you're studying Spanish, right? So when you study Spanish or you try to learn Spanish after learning French, and what you've learned, that is that new learning that you've done in your Spanish class, interferes with your recollection of what you studied initially in your French class, that is retroactive interference. So when we learn new things, sometimes it can interfere with our recall of stuff that we've learned previously. Whereas proactive interference is just the opposite. It's when old learning interferes with new and makes it harder to learn the new material. So now we're going to flip-flop this. So say I learned French initially, and now I'm taking a Spanish class. So here, the learning that I did in my French class in advance of taking Spanish is proactively interfering with my learning of Spanish. So these are examples of retroactive interference and proactive interference. So just think of retroactive as new interfering with old, and proactive as when old learning interferes with new. So interference is most problematic when new and old material is similar, and this kind of makes sense. So, for example, in the language example here, that if there's certain similarities in pronunciation or certain verb similarities and word similarities, that there's some overlap between the language, then you can expect there to be greater interference. And the greater the interference, the more difficulty that you're going to have in recall. So you can think of forgetting as a failure in retrieval due to interference, information overlapping and interfering with other information. So concept check for us here. Blank occurs when old information impairs the retention of newly learned information. Is that A, proactive interference, B, retroactive interference, C, anterograde amnesia, D, retrograde amnesia? The answer is A, proactive interference. Old interferes with new. So elaborate. This is you coming up with your own examples of the terms and the concepts we've discussed today. Retroactive and proactive interference, for example, and it will help in recall and comprehension. So go over this stuff, also this stuff, in the first lecture, and you will be more likely to recall it when it comes time to take a quiz or a test. Learning objectives for this section. Describe how retrieval cues and context cues are related to retrieval. Discuss the reconstructive nature of memory. Discuss source monitoring error and summarize evidence on the misinformation effect and its implications. Define repression and summarize both sides of the repressed memories controversy. Discuss how much an ineffective encoding, decay, and interference contribute to forgetting, and a couple of red font objectives here. Describe the role of the hippocampus in memory, and describe and distinguish between procedural memory and declarative, that is, semantic and episodic memory systems. You'll have to read about those in your text.